And so from there, Reko, if you could give the listeners a little overview of the stealing the key and eating the ashes, what exactly are these two in the story and what do they signify?
Big question. I'll really try to distill it here, but the stealing the key is, I see it as like an image of stealing your agency from the boyish tendency to regress into the mother. It's, in the story, the boy, in order to free the wild man from his cage, he has to go steal the key under his mother's pillow. And Michael Meade makes a great point about this. He says, the pillow is where your mother keeps all her dreams for you as a boy. My son, the accountant, my son, the real estate agent, my son, the grade A student, that sort of thing. So the key to your agency rests underneath that pillow full of your mother's dreams for you. And also the key to the wild man's release. So that wildness in your spirit, that electricity, there's something deep and mysterious and wise that's available outside of that tendency or that inclination to regress into your mother's safety, your mother's desires, your mother's comfort.
So, clarifying question. Now, this might be outing my own ignorance, and fair enough, this show is partly to alleviate my own ignorance through conversation with other wise folks. But it was my understanding that the boy in Iron John is a prince from another kingdom, and he's working in the kitchens of the kingdom, and that the key itself is under the queen's pillow. Is that correct?
So the boy originates in the kingdom where he is the prince to the king and the queen. And the wild man is brought into that kingdom. And it is then when he frees the wild man, they go into the forest together. And then from there, he goes to a second kingdom. So in the original
Right.
kingdom, the queen and the king are actually his parents.
Right. Okay. So that's a doubly interesting layer here because I had my wires crossed, obviously. That it's not only the mother that he interacts with when it comes to the reclamation of his sovereignty, but also the divine feminine incarnate, this queen figure. And the queen mother, that's something to be reckoned with in some sense, because as you noted, and as is shown in the story of Iron John, in order to have access to the wild man who was caged by the king and queen, it should be noted that it was locked down, the prince has to transgress, quite literally break the rule or break the trust, break the bond by stealing. And it's not just stealing from the kitchen or, from the food stores, but it's stealing directly from what is, like you said, one of the most intimate places, not only where she communes with the king, but also right under her own pillow where she's having these dreams. And how I've landed on this interpretation is that there's the embodied dissolution of the son mother bond comes from the willful decision to move counter to what was almost a unified expression of being. Allow me to put that more simply. When we're growing up as boys, and this is true for girls as well, we are non-separate from mother in a very non-trivial sense. Our nervous systems are one. As babies, we cannot distinguish self from mom. It's one entity. And so we have that baked in. And there's this tendency and desire to go along with the desire and will of mother because mothers are attuned to the vulnerability of children more than any other family member. So they have our safety in mind from an evolutionary point of view. So it is of great impetus for us to align with it. And yet, like you're noting, in order to actually access the gold, which is the wild man in some sense, but in the story, the prince kicks a golden ball into the wild man's cage. So there's this sort of double layering there. In order to get at something more than just boyhood, that actually has to be broken. And so hopefully that lends a clear picture for the listeners as to what stealing the key means, moving against this fundamental feminine relationship and setting out on our own. So I think that's good enough ground, at least for now, for a simplistic version. Let's shift to the symbol of eating the ashes.
The ashes part is a really fascinating phenomenon that I see with regards to how um, it's such a tempting experience for men to get stuck there. And Robert Bly describes it as a descent. So we're starting kind of like in the woods with the wild man, and then we descend into the kitchen because the kitchen is described as below the palace. So you're kind of going into this like dungeon kind of space. It's dark, you don't see the light, it's hot, and your job is just to rake the ashes out of the kitchen's oven, right? Keep the oven clean so that it can keep cooking and keep burning. And your job is just to be in the hot, sweaty, sooty kitchen basement, shoveling all the ashes out. And Robert Bly has a really it's one of the most powerful chapters in the book by far. And he makes a number of points around that. So I'd encourage people just read it or listen to it to get the full description. But why I see it as so tempting to get stuck there is because there's activity in it, there's movement. And I think the spiritual journey is inherently one of purification. Purify the body, purify the mind, purify the soul. That's what leads us to greater insight. That leads us to greater alignment with natural law and with our environment and with our community. It's also so eating the ashes is very much around purification. You're cleansing yourself of a lot of your past, your traumas, your wounds and addictions. But I see that it becomes itself an addiction, and ascending out of the ashes phase is something that there's a far more resistance to than going into it. One of the ways Robert Bly describes as going into the ashes is by social, a fall from social status. So you might lose your job, you might lose your house, your wife, all your possessions, your social circle, for a variety of reasons, right? You might have been a gambler, you might have been a drinker, you might have also just, got fired from your job. Life happens, fate happens. And with that, the fall occurs and puts us in that position to do that purification work. Typically, it occurs when we've become very stagnant. So life can push us down into it, or we can descend consciously. But either way, coming back up is something that I see that men really resist. And sitting in a men's circle, I ran one for 5 years, but I've been sitting in men's circles for closer to 10. And in that time, what I see is like the most excitement men get is when they're in the ashes.